Today on the Hobby Bench, I'll be talking about paints, brushes, and other things you might need on your painting bench. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about paints, brushes, and other things that you might need for painting your models. Quickly, people are going to ask, what type of paints do you need to use? And I see some people talk a little bit about, using these craft paints. They figure, it's so cheap, you get this large amount. I really recommend that you don't use these type of paints for your miniatures. They really sort of have some uneven pigmentation. You'll have difficulty getting them on your miniatures without having it maybe being too thick or too thin. Coverage is really uneven. I don't recommend you use these large bottle of craft paints. Spend the money and buy some good quality miniature paints. I use a lot of stuff from Vallejo. And honestly, okay, this is about $3.50, $4 for a bottle. This thing has lasted me for over a decade. You're not going to really go through this paint much at all. And so really the money that you save, maybe buying something like this, you really are going to be unhappy with the results that you get. You're going to have to try to repaint things. Things aren't going to come out worthwhile. Spend the money and buy some quality paints. Now, I will say for these type of craft paints, these are great on larger surfaces like bases. For terrain, absolutely. I would use this type of paints over these things for terrain any day of the week. But don't use these type of craft paints for your miniatures. Spend the money, buy some good quality paints. Next thing I want to ask about, the color range. Like how many paints do you need? At the least, you're going to need to fill out a color wheel. So you're going to need a red, you need orange, yellow, blue, green, and violet. That's the very minimum for that. In addition to that, you want to have a white and a black color. This will help you do a little bit of shading. You can mix some colors in together to maybe have 2 parts of red and 1 part of orange, and maybe like a touch of white, and that can maybe get a blend that you need. At the very least, that's what you're going to need. I would recommend actually to invest a little bit more is get 2 shades of each color. So if you have a green, buy a darker green. So then between these two, you can get colors that you want. Well, I'll talk about later some washes. Then one color could be your base, and then you could use another color, a darker color, thin down. That would be your wash. Or vice versa. You could have this as your base color, and then have this as highlights and dry brushing with a lighter green. So at the least that's what you want. If you can afford it and spend a little bit of money, I would go all out and get 3 different shades. So we have a nice mid-tone here, we have a darker color, and then we have a lighter color. And between these 3 here, you can get a lot of different shades that you need. And more importantly then, for washes and for dry brushing, for highlights, you've got a good mixture there. This is your base coat, let's say. You can add a little bit more of this to this color here, and you can gradually blend up to a more of a highlight that you want. You also always have white that you can work with. It's a little touchy, actually adding black to a color to make that a little darker. That's a possibility, but you're going to get some muddled results with that. Now, in addition to those kind of paints, what else would you need? I recommend also really getting a good gray. Obviously you can mix white and black together, but having a gray midtone, that helps a lot too. To expand out on that, then I think, it depends on what you're painting, but I recommend probably having some browns, some tans. These are really good universal colors to have. And I say, if you're going to be using a lot of fantasy miniatures and stuff, you've got halves of axes and spears, so you want to have a lot of browns. You might have a lot of leather, so you might want to have a go-to shade for that. You're going to slowly start filling that out and expanding that. That includes also, I would say, for flesh tones too. You want to have maybe a good couple of flesh tones that you use for skin. And so slowly you can accumulate through and get a fair amount of paints. You can also consider looking at some different odd hues. I have the nice pinks here. This is a very interesting color of turquoise. And so, these are some odder colors that you can have. You can always try to mix these colors out, and use white and really get the shades that you want. But sometimes if you've got a nice pink you can work with immediately rather than mixing a lot, that can sort of save you some time. Finally, I would also consider buy a couple of metallic paints. These are paints that have small little metallic flecks in it that will give like a sparkly color, if you will. It's almost like I want to say like sparkles in your paint. But this is a great way to add some life to different weapons and stuff. A very easy thing to do sometimes is not even using this as a base shade, but if say you have chainmail, you can paint that black and then like dry brush this metallic paint over that. And they have that little bits of reflective particles in it that will reflect the light and have that little bit of a sparkle. So, that's good to have a couple of metallic paints too. Broadening this out a little bit more on things to consider and things to buy, you can consider too also getting inks. Inks are very fluid and they have a high amount of pigmentation, but for washes and stuff and imparting more color, these are useful to have. And now you're sort of getting in some more peripheral things that you may not necessarily need, but consider looking at inks. For sure, I'd say for washes and stuff, and you don't even necessarily have to buy a model version of this, but sepia ink is a great type of wash. It's a very neutral color. These are the more peripheral things that you can get into. Some other things to consider also, maybe if you're really going to start looking through painting, look at maybe glaze mediums. This is a way of thinning out your paints to make them much more translucent. And you can really get some interesting shading going on with some glaze medium. Now, one thing I want to mention about the paints that you buy too and what you use, you can buy enamel paints. Enamel paints require spirits that require like a paint thinner to thin out and to clean up with. I would not buy those. Now, modeling of old, make the model kits and model tanks and stuff like that, enamel paints were pretty much all you had. You could buy these little tester bottles of enamel paints. But I recommend don't buy those. Really, you want to just get water-based acrylic paints. These things are easy to clean up. They're easy to work with, easy to thin out and use. I would recommend buying those. Don't really mess around with enamel paints. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about brushes. What brushes do you need? Well, really what I recommend is probably getting a decent sized small O brush. Like a 3/0 brush is a pretty good size there. And probably a little bit more of a larger brush. Let's say a 1/0 brush. Something that's going to be a little bit larger. These brushes have a pretty good tip that you can use to work with. And a larger brush here, same thing too, is you have a good tip and it has this a little bit more bristles there to hold up paint. So you could use something maybe more for putting on base coats and then something for more on finer detail. What I recommend is, interesting enough, is try to avoid getting brushes. Sometimes you buy a small O brush, it's got a very nice point, but it doesn't really have enough bristles to store the paint that you want. And actually, this brush here that I have is a better brush I normally use. And the reasoning is because it has more brush bristles. This holds a little more paint, so you're going to get a little bit more fluid transfer of the paint to your model than you would with something with like this. This is going to get a very fine point, and that's good and all, but it's going to dry out so fast that sometimes you're actually going to get not enough control with that. So when you're getting paints, you might think, oh, wow, I got a 10-0 brush. I need to use this. It's got such a small little point. That's going to be great for fine detail. I want to get a brush like that. I would sort of hold off on getting a brush of this sort. Because the brush bristles are so small, it really is not going to hold up much paint. You're going to actually continually go back to your palette to use it. You're going to get probably end up getting a little bit more brush strokes. It's actually a little harder to work with than a brush that has a little bit more bristles to it to hold that paint. I recommend you may want to get one of these for really, really fine, super fine details. There might be like buttons or some small little bits that you want to paint out and impart some color, but you're not going to like give a lot of coverage to something. It's just like some small, tiny little bits. That might be something to work with. But in general, you want to try to get paint brushes that have a good tip and maybe a little bit more of bristles on them. I would say for sure, if you're interested to see, when I work with a lot of contrast paints, I use this brush here. It has a lot more of area that the contrast paint can get into and stay in this tip here. It's a lot more transfer of that paint to the surface. It's much more fluid strokes I can get. And really what you want to think about and focusing and looking at is really the tip. You just want to have a sharp tip. Some other things considered too are like filbert brushes. These are a little bit more of a fan brush. And they've got, this one's sort of been a little bit ratty out here. But these are great for dry brushing larger surfaces. This is something to use. I recommend for sure, go out to the makeup aisle and buy some cheap makeup brushes. These are wonderful for dry brushing. They have very soft bristles, a lot of surface area there, and they can get torn up and they're not that expensive. These are great things to use for that. Now, going on about your brushes and taking care of them a little bit, you're going to have these small plastic tubes that come with them to protect the brush bristles. For sure, don't get rid of these things. You want to keep these around because you can accidentally get these mashed around of that sort. That'll help protect the tip by having these. When you're done, when you're working with your paints, what you want to try to avoid doing when you're cleaning or using them is mashing them down at the bottom of that. What you want to do is just draw this up to the side of the glass or your container for paints. And that's what you'll use to try to clean out that surface very well and working on that. And obviously the same thing on a paper towel. You want to drag those towards you. Don't push them out. Don't mash that down. That'll mess up those tips. Another thing too I recommend is when you let these dry, is let them dry at an angle or upside down where the paintbrush tip is facing down. If you store these wet and you let them dry this way, what's going to happen is the paint is going to go into the ferrule. That's the metal part where the bristles are. And there'll still be small amounts of paint that's going to be on there. As clean as you get it, you're still going to have some in there. And as that moves down into that ferrule, it dries out, it's going to start to expand and it will spread your brush bristles apart. So, store them for the first day upside down. Let that fluid in there transfer down into the tip, and then you can store them what you normally do brush side up. Now, some other things that you'll need for painting. Well, one thing for sure you're going to want is a mixing surface for your paints. You're going to need a paint palette. I recommend really getting, let's say, a plastic dish or maybe an old ceramic dish, and this is a good surface to work with. Ideally, you want it white so that it allows you to really see the color that you're working with. And so you'll need a mixing surface. It could be like maybe an old tile, an old plastic lid, an old dish, but you'll need a paint palette. Now, talking about palettes too, there's another thing you can consider getting, and that is called a wet palette. And this is sort of dried out. I don't really use this too much, but this is really good for, I think sometimes when you have consistently, you're mixing your paints, if you have a lot of models to do and you've got a larger project and you want to like paint over a certain amount of time and really keep going back to those paints and reusing them, a wet palette is a great thing to use. Another thing too, actually, it can impart a little bit more moisture to your paints and can allow a more even transfer of the fluid to your models. If you have it on these type of palettes here, these can sort of dry out. So it can be sometimes hard to figure out if it's too dry, if you need to add a little bit more water. This will help. These wet palettes will help take care of that. I usually paint in smaller spurts. I'm not painting usually one model at a time. So that's typically why I use, these type of palettes here rather than say a wet palette. I have a fancy palette here, but you can make your own wet palette. Basically get a Tupperware container, and then you want to get like a paper towel and wet that down. I think this is pretty good too. If you go to a grocery store, you can also buy here. This is a very pliable, spongy material. This is a good thing to use. What's nice about this one is that you've got a pretty rough surface here, but this other one's relatively flat. And all it needs is just some moisture in it. And you just want to get that damp and wet. This is super dry, so I'm not going to really give a good example of this. And then you just need parchment paper. Don't buy wax paper. You need baking parchment paper. The idea is that this is totally saturated, that you'll have this parchment paper down, and as you're working with the paints there'll be a small amount of moisture that will transfer through this, and it will keep that paint wet. You can cover up with an airtight lid. You can set it aside, pull it out the next day, maybe add just a little bit of water to it, and you can keep working those same paints. So wet palettes are a thing to possibly consider, depending on what you're painting typically. Now, talk about also for water, I recommend having a couple of jars of water. So I have one set aside I use for mixing my paints. That is clean water. And I have another one that I use for cleaning my brushes. So that would be for dirty water. So the idea is if I have my paints and I wanted to add some water to it to thin it out, I've got my clean water. And if I need to clean up my brush, then I have my dirty water pot to use. For sure, if you are working with any metallic paints, I recommend having its own container for cleaning your brushes and your own palette. You're going to have some small amounts of reflective particles that are in the paint, and odds are you're probably not going to get this super clean, and some of it may contaminate and get into your other paints. And so you'll paint out that lovely green shade and suddenly recognize, oh gosh, I've got a bunch of little metallic particles in it because I used a silver paint before. This will help reduce that immensely by just having its own segregated paint pots and segregated palette that you'll use just for metallic paints. Some other things to use, well, you need a good light source. I use a little table lamp here. I've got also another little IKEA lamp. I use this sometimes, and so you definitely want to have good light sources so you can see what you're painting and working with. Now, another thing too is that when you're painting up your model and you're just working in it, handling it by its base can be a little difficult to do. It's usually a pretty narrow piece of plastic. It's might be a little bit hard to grip and get angles that you need. So you need some type of holder I would recommend getting. You can use always like this bottle caps. And I have here what's blue tack. It's just this material, tacky material that you'll use, let's say, to put up posters on a wall that you can take down. It's pretty pliable and it's sticky, but it's not like glue or anything of that sort. And so you can put your miniature on something like this. And then you have a larger surface that you can grip and hold on. You can get some different angles with that. That's a good thing to work with. I'm a little older and geriatric in age, so I slowly have collected quite a bit of pill bottles. These things are great too. You got a nice something you can hold on to and work with. If you need to have a little bit of weight on that, if it's a little top heavy, the miniature that you're working with, you can have some washers that you put in the bottom of these things, and that'll allow it to give it a little bit more heft and weight. I've even splurged and bought some more fancy spring-loaded ones, but oddly, I hardly ever use these. I sort of go back to the default of pill bottles myself. But these are things that you can get and use. And I recommend for sure, investing a little bit and having those set aside. You can paint up a lot of miniatures. It's really great to have stuff like this here. It'll help you with being much more comfortable in painting over longer periods of time rather than just grabbing it by the base alone. So that's a conclusion for today. You're talking about paints and brushes and other little things that you might need for your paint bench. What I can't impart enough is spend the money and buy some good quality miniature paints. You can think about buying larger bottles and you think you're saving money, but in the long run, it's much better to have some good quality paints. Have a fair shade number of colors, something that you can work with, make it a little bit easier on you so you're not constantly mixing and matching to try to get the shade you need. And also looking at brushes, I consider when you buy a paintbrush, really you want to focus on the tip, how sharp the tip is, how well formed it is. That's what's really going to be going down the model. And not really focus necessarily on the size of the brush itself, but consider also maybe getting brushes that have a little bit more bristles on it. They're a little bit longer, can hold a little bit more fluid. Those are really the brushes I think consistently that you're going to get good results with. So that ends it for today. Next time I'll be talking about the big 3 painting techniques that you'll need for painting in miniatures.